Opinion. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pascal Dubois. Thank you to Régis Broudin for offering us to moderate this opening sequence. I will then give the floor to my colleague here, Cécile Desjardins, who works with me at L'Opinion to moderate the rest of the sessions. So I'll ask Cyrille Poirier-Coutansais to join me on stage. So we have a few minutes before us to talk about what makes the spice of your daily work, what's also a bit in the news. So that's what makes the spice of my daily work. You're the director of the research department of the Navy Strategic Studies Center, the chief editor of Etudes Marines, and you authored a number of books, The Class of Maritime Empires, and a much more recent one, which is the Relocalization of the World. This is a re-edition and prefaced by Pascal Lamy, well known by all those of you who think that the future of the planet is also a matter of international trade. We're going to talk about two emergencies that seems to be at the top of the agenda. The first one is the climate, and the second one is the geopolitical universe and the importance of an awakening, geopolitical awakening. So the climates first. Yes, well, the two feed each other, and that's going to write the future of the world in the next 20 to 30 years, because global warming, of course, has a geopolitical impact because it fragilizes a number of states. And on the other hand, geopolitical tensions have an impact on the fight against climate change, because if governments are not able to agree on a number of issues, on ways and means to fight climate change, of course, this is going to increase it. So this is the self-reinforcing phenomenon, and these two challenges in a confusing world, it's important to have a number of clear ideas to find our way and navigate the next few years. On global warming, there's one idea which is fairly muddled in Europe, but that is important, I think. It is that negative growth, ungrowth, is not a solution in the fight against global warming. It's essential, because if you don't understand this, if you don't take this on board, we won't get anywhere. Why isn't ungrowth a solution? Because in most countries in the world, we need development. An example amongst many others, in Kinshasa, you have 2 hours of power a day. So it's obvious that they'll need electricity 24 hours a day, and there are different ways to produce it. So it has an impact on your areas of business, because they're impacted the same way. In air transport, in the Franco-French debates and Europe-centric debate, we have an impression that air transport is going to decline. But if you look at the global scale, you realize, but of course you know that, you realize that most countries in the world, of course, do not have high-speed trains, that air transport is vital for travel in countries that have a huge size. Take China, India, and of course air transport in the next few years is going to grow. If you take maritime transport, it's exactly the same story. Maritime shipping, now you have 50% of shipping that carries bulk, so commodities, metals, but also, as was highlighted with the Ukrainian conflict, food commodities, wheat, cocoa, coffee, and that's not going to change either. And so that share of maritime shipping, at least, is still going to grow. So now that you've said that, if you look at the world around us and seeing that ungrowth is not an option, it's not an option either in developed countries, because the fight against global warming means that we'll need to create decarbonization technologies in power generation and propulsion, but these technologies will be imagined in developed countries because there's capital, because there are trained engineers. You also have industrial expertise, which is important to imagine these technologies.
That is also why developed countries cannot opt for degrowth. Otherwise, they will not be in a position to develop the decarbonation technologies, which will be then spread throughout the world. Let me give you a very simple example of that idea. Offshore wind energy. It was born in Denmark in the 1990s. It was massively subsidized. 30 years down the road, we're reaching the point when offshore wind can produce energy at market prices. That's an iconic example. This is an example which would need to be applied across sectors. Do you need in terms of duration? Well, we'll probably need to step up and accelerate. 40 years is a little too long indeed. But when it comes to industrial companies, they have definitely grown aware that they will need to accelerate. And in any case, there are regulations taken by states in this direction. But for your profession, for insurance, when it comes to aviation, to maritime industries, there's complete confusion when it comes to decarbonation. In the maritime industry, we're still testing out propulsion technologies, and same applies to aviation. So that means that in terms of certificates for such propulsion technologies, in terms of insurance as well, it's not going to be very easy. For the moment, it isn't in any case. And I'm only referring to ships and planes. But the problem will apply to airports as well, to ports. Because if you have a hydrogen-based propulsion system, for example, in terms of explosivity, there are a number of questions to be taken into account, and that will have an impact on insurance considerations. The same applies to biofuels. There are a number of certificate considerations, but also resources considerations to be taken into account. For example, there were tests made on agri-residues, and all of this happens in a context of climate change, global warming, which will have an impact on agricultural yields. So in terms of insurance, that's not simple either when it comes to modeling. So that will probably lead to interesting work for you in the years to come, but definitely challenging. And the other question is about the origin of such fuels. Hydrogen, for example. There are choices, very different choices depending on countries. Germany, for example, will be basing itself on green hydrogen produced in the south. For insurance companies, that will have an impact. Others will rather opt for hydrogen produced in Spain, for example. So in terms of insurance, again, that would lead to different impacts. All of this to say that when it comes to global warming, we would need to base ourselves on the certainty that we will indeed need growth. And then when it comes to the choices stemming from this, we'll need to imagine the kind of insurance we will need depending on the propulsion modes which are opted for. And I would say that intellectually speaking, insurance companies will need to do things differently with regards to their modeling and forecasting models. Does that change your vision as well as an expert? With regards to adverse climate events, extreme climate events, indeed, that would be the case. It's already started to happen in France with the Irma, the storm, which had a huge impact in the Caribbean, but also on a global level. Global warming has a number of existing impacts. And for example, when it comes to the Panama Channel, the level of water depends on the level of water inland. And due to the droughts, which happened a couple of years ago, the level of water decreased, generally speaking, and that led to a decrease in water levels within the channel. And so that led to a number of impacts, especially when it comes to measures taken out of precaution, for example. So I'm sorry about that question, which is probably due to me not knowing that place in the world in particular. But, you know, there's a general trend towards rise in sea levels, right? So wouldn't that compensate for a certain general level of water in that channel? No, the question is completely different. You only have you do not have any seawater in that channel over there. It's only fresh water. And when it comes to logistics, the level in the Rhine for container ships arriving in Hamburg, that leads to a number of issues. So for insurance, definitely there will be a series of impacts which were not necessarily anticipated 10 years ago, and which, however, will have a growing impact in the years to come for a number of sectors, and that includes aviation and maritime sectors. We also need to sound the alarm geopolitically. The general world order has been completely unsettled with the war in Ukraine. We've all followed up on the latest events this weekend as well. So the reality is there's growing tension, and that has an impact across the world and at sea as well. When it comes to maritime shipping and maritime insurance, from that standpoint, I believe that perhaps we can take a little bit of hindsight here. Piracy in Somalia has allowed us to have some kind of an experience. It's still happening to a certain extent in the Gulf of Guinea, but there was an overall disarmament movement which happened, and perhaps there are a few filibusters which may still be acting, but the situation is quite different. So piracy, Yemen was also an alert, and of course the war in Ukraine now. But as with global warming, perhaps in a rather changing world, we need to have a couple of clear things in mind to best anticipate on what is to come. So first of all, one needs to bear in mind that the war happening in Ukraine is not just a parenthesis. We are entering a brave new world geopolitically. This is not just due to Putin and Russia, because once that is over, we're not going to go back to the world as it existed before. A new geopolitical phase will be launched. Pax Americana might be taken into consideration for the 40 years. For the past 30 to 40 years, the U.S. were a key player, and everyone understood that no war could happen unless there would be an immediate response from the U.S. Saddam Hussein did not understand that. He invaded. He made his invasion, and the consequence that followed was pretty much immediate. And then, as China grew in power, the U.S. realized that they no longer could and wanted to be the only country in charge of securing world order. Barack Obama, when he was president, and the U.S. realized at that period of time that they could no longer have that role in the world, and they decided to make that move towards Asia. And from that moment, a number of states in the world thought that perhaps if they were to adopt a different position, there would not be any impact, any consequence. And that leads us to the current era. And that reminds us, in a way, of the Cold War era with the U.S. versus the USSR. There were so many regional conflicts with the, for example, Arab-Israeli conflicts, and they were not able to control the entire world, and they would sometimes enter into confrontation by proxy. So the same is happening right now. We're going to have to strike a balance to stabilize things, but that's going to be challenging. And also there's the question of a world power emergence. You spoke of Obama, but there were two disruptions at work here. Barack Obama considered that the U.S. would no longer have that role in the world to secure the world, and then Trump designated China as a permanent opponent that one would need to make sure that they would have the right weapons to fight against them when the time would come. So we'll come back to Russia later on, but is China, in the current state of affairs, are they the main unknown factor in this equation? Well, China, as it developed, had a policy for 20 or 30 years, which was very consistent, very classic. They became dependent on the sea, and so they wanted to secure their supplies. 80% of their hydrocarbons go through the ocean, so you need safety at sea and security at sea, so you need to have the right resources to do so. So they had that policy. But there are a number of question marks that remain today with regards to internal balances within the Chinese state. For years and years and years, there was a rotating system, so to speak, with the powers that be in Shanghai, which were rather open to the world and who were in power. And then on the other end, you had people such as Hu Jintao, who were from the Red Guardian movement. So there were these discussions between the Chinese, within the Chinese party, and due to that discussion, China's position was rather balanced. But now there seems that there has been a strong disruption, and Xi Jinping is the #1 ruler, undefeated ruler in China. And then you have U.S. uncertainties with regards to what China may decide. And today's period is highly complex in the sense that we'll have to strike the right balance. Will we be able to make that happen? We're not sure, but strike the right balance to take into consideration the fact that China is an actual power and build an architecture which would be rather balanced. Is Taiwan the key to it all? Taiwan would be a key amongst many others. But one thing to be taken into consideration for Western state is they need to understand that the states from the global south, so-called global south, are not standing with or against one country in particular. And for Western countries and for China as well, it's not just about attracting these countries and having them on their side. It's about understanding their needs needs, and it's about having diplomatic relationships with these countries to agree on certain issues and to agree that there's some kind of a disagreement on other topics and to move on, which is not necessarily so obvious for certain countries. We've been used to just taking for granted a number of countries, but now we're going to have to take into consideration their needs and go back to the diplomatic drawing board, and that's not something that flows quite naturally for the moment. Last week, for example, there was a summit which was held in Paris. And that was definitely the idea in between the lines with regards to these new relationships. So coming back to the theme of the U.S. and the U.S. Navy, have they disappeared from certain areas in the world to go over to the Asian seas? Well, in the Indian Ocean, it's quite striking. There's barely any U.S. Navy forces in the Indian Ocean now. And with regards to that wake-up call from a geopolitical standpoint, that particularly stands for Europe. The EU, for the moment, is barely starting to understand that the world might be a little bit more of a dangerous place geopolitically. So that calls for new action. Since the U.S. Navy is not as present in the Indian Ocean, I mean, could you give us a few figures perhaps to understand? They are barely there now. They have pretty much completely left. They need to concentrate their forces in the Indian Pacific area, and they are no longer dependent on the Arabic Gulf, since they have completely shifted their production. But in the EU, we need them. We no longer import any gas directly from Russia. We have to go through the Arabic Gulf, and that will call for a certain operations in the Indian Ocean for the EU. So that's a new frame of mind to be adopted for the EU. And yet, we still view the U.S. as an ever-standing ally to ensure our protection. But as a matter of fact, we'll have to take charge of more and more things. Maybe some kind of an EU Marine Forces? Well, we have pooled resources to a certain extent, and it's been quite successful in the EU, as represented by the Atalante operation in Somalia to fight against piracy. So that's a resource pooling system with common HQ, and then we call upon ships from various member states to ensure operations in that area. And that was also something that we did with permanent maritime cooperation schemes in the Gulf of Guinea. And that will probably need to be done as well in the Indian Ocean to have massive operations over there and to secure our ship owners over there and operations. But isn't there some kind of a permanent scheme? Well, it's more tools that we have experimented with and that we can reactivate and have that work in the long run should we need that. And who are the pillars of that scheme? Well, unsurprisingly, France, of course, and EU countries with interests. So the Danish, for example, Spain is also there. We will not have Slovakia, for example, but it's all about gathering more and more countries in these cooperation schemes. How about the Brits? Well, you know, they're always more or less there. Yes, more or less, I guess, yeah. So they are more or less there. Less or more? It really depends on what you're talking about. In some cases, they are very much so present, and in others, not so much. Yeah, that's the Brits for you. I wanted to come back to what you said about the pact for new financing, the summit, which was held last week in Paris on Thursday and Friday for the so-called BRIC countries. They no longer depend on one power or the other. They want to exist as such in their own right. I'm not sure how long that will take and how long it will take for the Western EU, shall we say, and the US to view these countries differently. But my question is, will there be one day amongst those who indeed can become such, for example, Brazil and India, will they ever have a world rank kind of marine forces? Well, India, there's a clear willpower to go in that direction with massive investment. They're not quite there yet, but there's a will. But, you know, having significant Navy forces, you need to take into consideration the direct and immediate threats. Brazil does not have any in its area, but India, with regards to when it comes to the Indian Ocean, when it comes to the situation with China, it's more urgent for them to develop significant Navy forces. And with regards to the role that they might want to play in the world, as far as that goes, definitely having significant Navy forces would be very important. There is, when it comes to Latin America, there is no geopolitical threat in their immediate surroundings, so there's no need to massively invest urgently, when in fact other sectors have urgent needs such as education, etc., and health. But India, they already have marine forces in the sense that they have any projection capacities, and that is indeed the case. But India has a long tradition of submarines, for example, with the naval group, and they've signed deals with TKMS, a German company, and also with aircraft carriers. But with China, for example, there were collisions in the Himalayas, and China is more and more present in the Indian Ocean. So as far as India is concerned, there are a few things happening out there, and they might need to shift things up a bit, since there are threats. We often have the idea that there cannot be any conflict with conventional weapons between states, but for those countries which have nuclear weapons. But when it comes to Pakistan and India, for example, 3 times already we've had a counterexample of this. And then China and the USSR with the Amur River, both states have nuclear power, but there was a significant conflict between both. So what does that mean? Does that mean that when it comes to deterrence, things are working? Yes, deterrence works, but there can be conventional conflicts. And as Europeans and for other countries in the world, we need to bear that in mind. When you want to exclude out of principle that there will be a conflict between the US and China about Taiwan, we need to bear that in mind. The US will not invade China. China will not invade the US. US, but there might be some kind of a localized conflict, as was the case in Korea. So let us not exclude that out of principle. Well, if we go around the world of the maritime and take a look at the maritime regions which are undergoing tension. You spoke about the Indian Ocean, but how about Australia? Is this a challenging area? Well, the entire Asia-Pacific area is dominated by that tension between the US and China. As years go by, the states in that area have to say who they are standing with. And that has led to a number of interesting things. For example, Vietnam, now they have submarines since China was increasing its marine resources. So, and that has led to a number of states going completely over the board with their armament resources. And how about Iran, closer to home, which is a permanent potential threat for certain countries, first of which Israel. That's an issue indeed, since, first of all, we are close enough to that country, and also there are a number of discussions and new shifts in the region. Saudi Arabia and Iran have entered into discussion when, until recently, they would not have ever discussed with one another. And these regional situations, in some cases, can be good news because it's good for these regional players to discuss with one another directly without necessarily needing any kind of external sponsor. Saudi Arabia, for example, with regards to Iran. Well, Saudi Arabia wanted to find a solution for the war in Yemen, which is a protracted conflict, and Iran is a major player in that area. So that led to discussions and to trying to find a certain balance in that area. Well, on a scale of Richter of conflicts, what score would you give to Iran in that region? Well, I would not want to anticipate on anything. It's really hard to do so. It's a challenging region. Iran is about to have nuclear weapons, and then within Iran, the population is revolting against the power in place. So the Near and Middle East is not really well balanced for the moment, and it's an explosion waiting to happen for the moment.
Now, regarding countries, it's not always easy to read Turkey's intentions. It's a NATO member, but at the same time, it's showing ambiguous signs vis-a-vis its closeness with the West. Well, there are two ways of looking at Turkey. Well, if you take their relationship with the West, with our Europe-centric view, you might think, well, Turkey is playing an ambiguous game vis-a-vis us, but you could take the opposite view, showing that Turkey is playing its role as a regional player. It's got its own interests, which are related to its president, of course, but I'm not sure that if there had been a change in power in Turkey, there would have been a full 180-degree turn in their foreign policy. Turkey's got its own interest in the Middle East and Central Asia. And it's also up to us, Europeans, to understand these questions. And understanding that means that in the next few years, we're going to have to negotiate even more with Turkey because, yes, Turkey is playing its role. It's playing its own game, and this is difficult for us. But do you feel that it's more Western than Turkish? It's a mixture. It's always been a mixture. If you go around Turkey in the big cities, you can see the population amongst the young is not very different from young Europeans, and they're aspiring to the same things, watching almost the same things. I'm talking about the big chunks of the population, and a lot of them emigrate to Europe. But beside that, indeed, you've got a country that also wants to have a regional weight, again, that really wants to matter in the region. So it's a mixture of all this. There's both an attraction for the Western lifestyle, if only in terms of development, but at the same time, this is a matter that really wants to have some weight in the area. Coming back to France, well, not necessarily mainland France, but New Caledonia, Polynesia, these are regions that are not far away from Chinese ambitions in terms of possession, but in terms of influence. How's that manifested? Well, yes, there's quite visible Chinese influence, but then New Caledonia and Polynesia, these are two overseas territories that are extremely different. New Caledonia, you've got a lot of people of European extraction that is present. So this question of the internal balance of society is, well, the number of referenda show that it's complicated. Yes, Polynesia is quite different from Caledonia, but you can see that for these two territories, we've reached the end of the traditional relationship that there was between the mainland and its territories. We'll need to rethink this in order to find new equilibria, as it were. How's Chinese pressure exerted? Well, in Polynesia in particular, you've got a big Chinese population. That, yes, they've been here forever, almost. And at the Chinese consulates, you see a bigger presence and bigger connection with this community. So that has repercussions on the internal balance in Polynesia. So it's something to monitor. It's to be monitored, yes. Well, by us. We need to keep an eye on it. Should we go against it? Should we rebalance it? Rebalance it, yes, without a doubt. When you're in Polynesia, and once again, we're talking about big orders of magnitude, but the Chinese community has tended to look inward onto itself, whereas it used to be smoother. And there are other factors at play as well. This is a community that's very present in trade, so there can be tensions also as well, and a lot of elements at work here. But what is important is that in the mainland as well, we'll need to rethink our relationship both with New Caledonia and Polynesia, the way we look at them, because this is almost the old Chirac-style model. Well, what is a Chirac-style model? Well, we're still talking about tax-free investment into these areas. Economically, we'll need to overhaul everything. Well, in these regions that are very far from the mainland, there is no European aspirations. Well, it's very far. Yes, but these regions are important for France and Europe. Well, yes, there is a European aspiration, but keep in mind, I'm thinking of Polynesia here. For young Polynesians, currently, there's one university that goes up to the bachelor's level. And very often when talking about getting access to vocational training and studies, for them, you need to go to Paris, basically, if you want to study beyond a bachelor's. We need to rethink that, because access to higher education that is being defended in France for young people in rural areas, well, the issue is exactly the same and even heightened in Polynesia. But then the way Europe looks at these territories, there's a French view of these territories, a European view, I'm not so sure. No, really. Well, Italy has deployments in the Indo-Pacific, but these are territories that are not well known, and they're not necessarily interesting for member states of the EU in terms of markets, just from that viewpoint. France is one of the global leaders in terms of shipping with CMA CGM. France has global leaders in terms of insurance. Some of them are in the room. Are we really a global maritime power? In some sectors, yes, without a doubt. But not all. Yes, not all. Well, compared to the size of the country, given what we've been able to develop, we have a non-negligible rank either in shipping and containers, maritime insurance, also undersea cables, but we're at a crossroads in terms of resources. There's one issue that is essential for the future, that's digital marine data. Digital data that are captured directly from the ocean with satellites. Unseen Labs was presented this morning, so data captured by satellites or by buoys. And now we're going to have more and more data from the ocean, also a large number of drones in the oceans. And the whole challenge will be to know what companies are going to be able to imagine applications based on these data, and applications that will become disruptive, similar to Google Maps in its time. We saw what happened on land, at sea. The same thing is going to happen in the next decade and a half. And in France, if we want to maintain our rank, have a rank that still matters, this use of digital marine data is vital. I was really struck. I was having lunch with François Willy, the head of IFREMER, the French Sea Research Institute, and he was just coming back from the US, where he discussed with his US counterpart, who said, well, in fact, the blue economy is one thing for us Americans. It's about digital marine data. It's not about shipping or anything. It's about data. And I'm comparing that with movements in the last 3 years where you can see Singaporean or US funds investing in startups that process data and create data based on maritime digital data. And this is something we need to look at. In France and the EU, it's essential. Of course, the sea is a concern for all those who focus on global warming and the climate emergency. You said you know that there are 40 students in the room today. What would you tell them? You're one of the main experts of all things maritime. What would you tell them to attract even more people, more young people to the maritime universe? Well, first of all, we need to raise its profile. Because for a few years now, I've been working in this sector, but it's always so difficult. I'd like to say that you have French Navy socks on. So, well, you have French Navy socks, so you're really invested. Yes. Well, we need to attract young people. So for that, you can wear French Navy socks. Well, yes, these are difficulties we're facing in all our businesses. That's also specific to France. We need to raise our business's profile. And that's very, very complicated. But for young people, if we wanted to attract them, I think there are two messages. There's the notion of the energy transition and therefore of the climate, because this is a major challenge and there are a lot of things to imagine and a lot of companies being created or that are also already here working against climate change. And the sea. The sea, it's still a fairly extraordinary universe. If you're having a dinner with friends and you're talking about the sea, immediately people get interested, they tick. And people still dream about the sea. And so it's at least worth a shot. You can try your luck and discover it. You needn't stay your whole life in this sector, but try it. Thank you.